Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. While the budget battle rages on in Washington, corporate titans and their lobbyists are gearing up for a different sort of fight. One to overhaul the corporate tax rate to make it even easier to keep their massive profits out of the reach of Uncle Sam. Now, joining me to discuss this disturbing trend is Nomi Prince. She's the author of this book here, It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. Nomi, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you back on the program.
Thank you.
Now, I want to start by asking, how do you think we got to this point, a point where it seems like the biggest companies seem to essentially dictate how this country's finances are handled?
For the first part of that, the biggest companies also pay for the most lobbying to create tax law that benefits them, for the best and brightest and largest accounting staffs that help them navigate the laws that they create and really game the entire tax system in their for their benefit. So that's kind of how we get here. And what's going on now is there's this philosophical myth that has been taking Washington by storm. It's always been around, but for some reason recently it's been inflamed, that somehow if these companies that have shirked tax law, that have taken a lot of their money offshore so that profits can't even be judged, let alone taxed, are somehow, if they get a lower tax rate, going to bring it all back, create more jobs, and, I don't know, fire their accounting staffs and take back their loopholes, which is ridiculous. But it is the argument that's going on right now in Washington.
Well, President Obama, a Democrat, in his State of the Union address promised to close these loopholes and reform the tax rate. And now we're sort of seeing the administration itself renege on those promises. Talk about what's happening behind the scenes there. I mean, I thought this was supposed to be a Republican versus Democrat issue, right?
It's a corporate versus regular people issue more than anything else, and we have a government that is not just run by corporations, it's funded by corporations in terms of laws, but it's not funded by corporations in terms of taxes. The revenues, the tax revenues, which you just talked about in your earlier segment, which we don't have enough of, which is why we have a budget problem, were $2.1 trillion last year. Only 8.9% of that were paid by corporations. So $187 billion out of $2.1 trillion were paid by corporations. Almost 80% of what went in came from us. It came either from Social Security, benefits, or direct individual taxes. So we pay, and corporations get the benefit not just of services, but of continuing to dictate the policy that happens in the United States. And when Obama originally campaigned on a platform of helping individuals, of standing up to Wall Street, all of that happened in a time where it seemed to him, and it was politically expedient, to recognize there was a problem, that there was a crisis, that the banks had screwed everything up. And now, 2 years later, the banks are sitting on a lot of profits. They're not paying taxes. Bank of America is one of many. The 6 biggest banks have 900 subsidiaries they've created offshore to avoid paying taxes in a part of their profits. And it's not expedient anymore to somehow talk about this. It's as if none of that happens and none of the crisis happened. And we are not really, as individuals, footing the majority of the bill for everything that happens in this country.
Well, and in Bank of America and ExxonMobil and GE, I mean, the list goes on. But, you know, you hear from the conservatives and from the president and lawmakers that this country has one of the highest tax rates for corporations, 35%, much higher than a lot of other nations. And that if we need to lower this tax rate, or otherwise all these businesses will just go to our rivals. How do you respond to that? I mean, that's a little playing with the numbers here.
Well, exactly, and that's where hiring creative accountants comes in. The tax rate is 35%, and on the face of that, that is higher than most countries. But the effective tax rate, what actually comes in on average, is only 13.4%, which is actually lower than a lot of countries. It's not lower than the 0% that you would get in an offshore account in the Grand Cayman, in the Cayman Islands, but it's certainly lower than many other countries. And the 35% figure gets thrown around as if that's actually what was happening. If 35% was the actual figure, then instead of paying $187 billion out of $2.1 trillion, corporations would have paid closer to over a half $1 trillion into the $2.1 trillion, which is still a smaller portion than individuals, but certainly much more. So 35% is really a meaningless number. And therefore, it is equally meaningless, actually more dangerous, to discuss policy right now, which would reduce that 35% to 25%, which is what's being discussed right now in one of the Republican proposals, because that just takes us down almost, why bother collecting taxes at all from corporations? Their percentage relative to everyone else is so very low. So it's really the wrong direction, obviously, to go in.
I mean, it just baffles me that we're at this time where, this entire country does actually finally seem to be focused on our spending issues, our spending problems, now that the government shutdown is looming. And I just don't understand why nobody, neither in the mainstream media, neither some of the politicians, I mean, not all politicians are beholden to corporate interests. So why is it that nobody is bringing up this point that we're essentially asking this country to sacrifice on the backs of the working class while giving these giant companies a complete break, a free pass? I don't understand it.
No, it's like those voices have disappeared. I mean, certainly they're not coming from the administration. They're not coming from the Republican Party, and they don't seem to be coming from the Democrat Party. And yes, there are some politicians who might see this. But somehow the dialogue has transformed from the budget being an actual revenue problem, not collecting enough taxes, not having enough money go into the government, and having such a very small percentage coming in from corporate America anyway, to begin with, into us having a spending problem. Now, our spending did increase. Our debt increased by $4 trillion in the last 2 years when the Treasury Department issued another $4 trillion worth of Treasury bonds to effectively help the banking system and the corporate system that funds itself through the banking system continue to chug along. That's why they have an extra $2 trillion of cash on hand. That's why there's an extra $1 trillion just from the banking system sitting at the Fed doing nothing, except basically being there as a cash reserve for the banks. And you have money around, you have revenue around, you have the ability to tax and to take back and to balance the budget in a different way. And instead, the argument continues to focus on cuts. And we can cut and cut and cut. The reality is if revenue doesn't get increased, it won't matter because there is too much of a gap in terms of what comes in.
Well, it seems that the only thing that we're really lacking is courage from our political leaders. Thank you so much, Nomi, author of It Takes a Pillage.